morning, everyone. Welcome to Daily Devotions through Redeeming Life Fellowship. If we haven't met before, I'm Dan. I'm the teaching pastor here at Redeeming Life, alongside Jesse El Padre Eisenhower. And today we're actually going to continue our journey through the Revive School reading plan. If you've been following along, you know that we've just finished the book of Romans, the first in the list of the New Testament of the Pauline epistles. And we finished up the book of Romans yesterday, with Romans 16, and today we're going to be jumping right into the next book in the Pauline corpus called 1 Corinthians. And before we jump into the text, I wanted to pause and make some general observations, reminders about what the Pauline epistles are and how we should read them, and then offer a very brief introduction into 1 Corinthians before we dig right into the text of chapter 1. And so one thing that's important to remember about the Pauline epistles, an epistle is a fancy word for a letter, and so that Paul, in this case, like it was, he was writing to the church in Rome. This is Corinthians, so he's writing to the church in Corinth. The function of the epistle, unlike the way that we typically think about, letters of personal correspondence, of just catching up and wanting to know how they're doing, wanting them to know how you're doing, want you to know how they're doing, pen pal stuff. What you have in a Pauline epistle is something that's called like an oral text. That's the way Ben Witherington, I think, rightly describes it, where the text itself is something like a surrogate for his actual presence in that congregation. So that while Paul, as we're reading through Acts, you know that he's constantly on these missionary journeys, going on these circuits through Asia Minor, into Greece, and aiming towards getting to Italy, getting to Rome, getting to Spain eventually, is what his heart's desires for. And so he's moving from churches to churches and looking for windows of opportunity for bringing the gospel to places where it's never been before. And so some places where he comes to a city, he doesn't stay very long. Other places like Corinth, he stays 18 months. Prior to the writing of 1 Corinthians, we know from the book of Acts that Paul spent a considerable amount of time in the city of Corinth, among the churches, among the Christians there, and pouring into their lives. And doubtless have gotten to know a good many of the people within the church of Corinth pretty intimately. Unlike the book of Romans, where Paul is writing to a church where he's never been before, in this case, he's writing to a church and to a people who he probably knows quite well. And like Romans, it's important to remember that Paul is writing pastorally, where he's spent, 18 months of serving as a pastor, and not just bringing the gospel to the people of Corinth, but helping them to grow in their knowledge and their understanding of the gospel. And to that extent, even more so than Romans, a book like 1 Corinthians is very occasional. What we mean by occasional, not meaning occasional in the sense of something just, happening here, there, now and again, but rather there's a specific occasion for writing a book like 1 Corinthians. And we see the occasion already alerting in chapter 1. Look at chapter 1, where in verse 11, it says, "Brothers, some from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels among you." So quarreling is an issue. What I mean is this: one of you says, "I follow Paul," another, "I follow Apollos," another, "I follow Cephas," still another, "I follow Christ." So even from almost from the very beginning, as soon as verse 11, we can see that that word has reached Paul's ears about divisions that are happening among this church in Corinth, divisions that were not there when Paul was present with them. And this troubles Paul for very significant reasons. So much so that he responds by writing this letter. So again, like any of the Pauline epistles, you want to be able to pause long enough, but to ask yourself as you're reading, what is the problem and what is the solution? What is the issue that Paul is intending to address, and what is the sort of solution that's being afforded? And this is where, unlike in Romans, where he spends a great deal of time, say chapters 1 through 11, just unpacking this picture. What is the gospel? And unpacking its inner logic from beginning to end. This one, it's with Corinthians, it's very different because it happens to be occasional, and he's dealing with specific problems that are plaguing the Corinthian church. So it's important that we keep our antennas up, as it were, for what are the issues that the Corinthians are dealing with. And here's where the situation in Corinth and understanding what's happening is especially important for people like you and me as we sit down and read the Bible and study it together. The church in Corinth is a body of believers who have received the gospel that that Paul has unpacked at length in a book like Romans, talking about the righteousness of God that comes through faith. Gospel as being the power of God for the salvation of all who believe. There's the gospel and how it relates to Israel, the gospel and how it produces a fruit of righteousness in a transformed life. We've gotten this marvelous picture about what the gospel is, and the gospel has been given, the good news of Jesus Christ, what God has done through him, has been given to the church in Corinth, and they have it, they received it, and it's beginning to change and affect their lives in fruitful ways, as Paul's spent time with them and 18 months worth of just nurturing this seed that he's planted among them. The problem for the Corinthians is that though that they've received the gospel and have learned things about the gospel, they haven't actually understood it. And their lack of understanding is betrayed through their actions and the issues that are causing this division and this corruption in this church that Paul has this heartfelt concern for. And the problem that faces the Corinthians is the same sort of thing that we face, and it's particularly this, is that what the Corinthians still haven't quite got is the way in which receiving the gospel and understanding the gospel should, indeed must, make an effect or a change in the way it is that they live and orient their lives, in the way in which that they come together as a church, in the way in which that they have their they orient their relationships with their spouses, the way that they orient their relationships with their associates or their patrons, the way in which that they understand how to do life together. And it reminds me of this, just a short digression. At one time, when I was at Gordon Conwell, I just finished a course on 1 Corinthians and was just finishing up writing a paper about 1 Corinthians 11. And so my head is in Corinthian world. And up to this point, right to the very end of the semester, my wife and I had to go to a wedding. I say had to go to a wedding. She enjoys that kind of stuff. I'm not very sentimental, and so in my head, it's more of an obligation than it is a celebration, but I digress. So so we go to this wedding, and while she's busy helping with decorations and setting up, I'm finishing my paper that has to be submitted that day in 1 Corinthians. So I'm focusing on Corinthians, and it finally comes to the ceremony, and not surprisingly, at the ceremony, the love chapter of 1 Corinthians is read aloud. You know that love doesn't delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. Always hopes, always trusts, always perseveres. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Most of us are familiar with that chapter, and as I was at that ceremony and hearing this chapter recited, this love chapter, I kept thinking to myself, the love chapter is great, and it's in many ways sort of the centerpiece to the whole book of 1 Corinthians. But I thought to myself, if more and more spouses, husbands and wives, took seriously the entire message of 1 Corinthians about how to do life together, there would be a lot more happy marriages, a lot more fruitful marriages, wholesome marriages, because the message of 1 Corinthians, it's a book that's intended to reorient to the whole church in Corinth and all of the relationships that are going in there back around the cross. The way in which that what unites them and brings them together and gives them the point of gathering together is the self-sacrificial love expressed in the cross of Jesus Christ, about what God has done. And if that's at the centerpiece of everything that brings people together, then they can truly live as the redeemed people of God. So this is a very long digression, but it's one of the things that I find especially important about a book like 1 Corinthians, because it's helpful for you and I to think through not just what is the gospel, but understanding the gospel and understanding how the gospel should, indeed must, make its felt impact within our everyday lives. So thank you for your patience with that. And so we're going to dive a little bit into 1 Corinthians, and I want you to remember this, that in 1 Corinthians, chapters 1 through 4 is really one section, and one section that's unpacking at length how about wisdom and foolishness and the purpose of church leaders and their proper role. And Paul's unpacking this at length to at least try and heal some of the divisions that are happening in Corinth. And by this point, something has happened where Paul had spent 18 months in Corinth, had to retreat, to continue his missionary journey, and Apollos comes, and Apollos is a much more eloquent speaker than Paul. Paul may be something of a pastor, theologian, scholar in his own right, but he's not an eloquent speaker. Apollos, on the other hand, is a very eloquent speaker, and so it's happening where the people within the Corinthian church are giving way to partisan politics, to say, I'm of Apollos, or I'm of Cephas. That's another word, or the Aramaic word for name for Peter, where so that the church is getting divided based upon who it is that they want to follow. And Paul will have none of it by forcing the issue back on them and saying, was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized into the name of Paul? Are you really giving way to divisions based upon these Christian leaders who brought the gospel to you? Who it is that you're following isn't really just following the speaker, but following Christ. So at this point, while the Corinthians have received the gospel, they haven't grasped the gospel by way of which they haven't grasped the gospel as evident from their attachment to these particular theological leaders, that they've made a leader or a person the center point of their reason for following. In effect, they make the person, the teacher, the apostle, the center point for coming and participating and bearing the name of Christ. And I think we all have tendencies to do that. Whether there's somebody who's been influential or instrumental in our own lives, and say, as long as this person is helpful or useful or instrumental in my life, that I'm going to make that person the center point of all of my faith. And Paul knows how dangerous that is, particularly because he knows that the gospel isn't about taking frail leaders and elevating them to a place where they're supposed to be worshipped. Because we all have a tendency of taking influential, eloquent speakers, people, YouTube channels, podcasts, special books, leaders on television, whether you're sort of a Joyce Meyer person or a John MacArthur person or a Voddie Baucham person. For me, I'm a C.S. Lewis person. I love C.S. Lewis. But truth of the matter is, C.S. Lewis, Joyce Meyer, Joel Osteen, Voddie Baucham, John MacArthur, former President Trump, President Biden, none of them died for your sins. None of them has the power, the ability to atone for your sins, has the power to redeem you and to restore right fellowship with the living God. So as great as any of those teachers or persons are, none of them can be the center point of your worship. And it's no use trying to follow this one person or the other to try and think that because they're so great, and if I follow in their footsteps, that's going to make me so great. Because read we're going to read a little bit of 1 Corinthians 26 through 31, and then we'll close. It says, "Brothers, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of this world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of this world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God, that is, our righteousness, our holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let him who boasts boast in the Lord." Can you see the way in which that attachment of certain parts of the church following different leaders comes with it pride and enmity and discord and infighting between the church? And Paul says, look at what God did by choosing the things that were lowly, the things that that were despised, the things that are not, to nullify the things that are. That if this is what God has done, the way in which that you gather can't be around party politics. Because this is what's going to bring hostility and discord, and therefore unfruitfulness within the church. That just simply doesn't have any reason to be there. And so a book like 1 Corinthians, and indeed chapters 1 through 4, is instructive for me to correct my thinking about church leaders, who they are, their right place and their right purpose, and to help me not lose my attention, or that in my life and in my ministry and my family relationships and work relationships, that I do not lose sight of the gospel, that I would never lose sight of the cross of Christ and its power to transform and invigorate and indeed rescue our lives and make them fruitful before the Lord. So that was a lot. I thank you so much for being so patient. I love you all very much. Again, if you haven't subscribed to this YouTube channel, please be gracious and do so. And I really just hope for that opportunity. I look forward to it. Anticipate the time when we're able to meet together in person here at our house on Wednesdays and Sundays. And that if it can't happen then, I'll hopefully see you next Thursday. And we'll be able to unpack at length what Paul's dealing with, which, let me see here, it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So we'll actually hopefully be finishing the 1 Corinthians 1 through 4 then. But I love you all very much, and God bless you and keep you, and may you grow in his wisdom and knowledge and love all the days of your life. So God bless you all very much.